My grandmother left me $850K while my dad and brother got nothing. But when I read her letter, I discovered why I was the invisible son for 27 years. And the truth I revealed destroyed my family forever. I'm 27 years old. I work in accounting for a mid-sized company in Albany, and I still can't believe my grandmother left me almost $1 million while my dad and brother got nothing. Well, technically my dad got something, just through me, and that's what caused this whole mess that basically destroyed what was left of my family. The thing is, when my grandmother died about 8 months ago, I thought it was going to be a normal funeral. You know, everyone sad, some cousins I hadn't seen in years. I had no idea I was going to discover a secret that had been buried for over 30 years, and that would basically explain my entire life. I should start at the beginning, I guess. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, like one of those places where everyone knows everyone and not much happens. My dad was like 52 when all this happened, my mom a bit younger, and my brother Michael is 3 years older than me, so he's 30 now. For as long as I can remember, Michael was always the favorite. And when I say favorite, I don't mean he got a little more attention. I mean it was like I was invisible. Michael played soccer in high school and my dad didn't miss a single game, screaming from the stands like crazy, wearing his jersey, the whole thing. I played saxophone in the school band, and my parents came to exactly 2 concerts in 4 years, and in one of those they left early because Michael had a game the next day and they needed to rest. It wasn't just sports, it was everything. Michael got a B and it was a celebration. I got straight A's and I barely got a well done. Michael got a part-time job at a store, and my dad bought him a car, a used Honda Civic but in good condition, so he could get to work. I got a better-paying job at a restaurant and had to take the bus for 2 years until I saved up to buy my own piece of crap car that broke down every 2 weeks. Looking back now, I understand why, but at the time I just thought there was something wrong with me, that I wasn't good enough, or that I had done something terrible without realizing it. My mom was more neutral, let's say, but she never did anything to balance things out. Like, she didn't necessarily treat Michael better, but she also didn't defend me when my dad clearly ignored me or minimized everything I did. It was like she had decided her role was to keep the peace and not get involved, which basically meant I was on my own in this. I remember once, I must have been like 15, almost 16, and I asked her directly why Dad always preferred Michael. She got all uncomfortable and told me something like I was imagining things, that my dad loved us both the same, but I knew it was a lie. I could see it every single day. The relationship with my grandmother was different. She lived about 2 hours away, and we didn't see her super often, maybe at Christmas, Thanksgiving, that kind of occasion. But when we were there, she always made sure to ask me how I was doing, what I was doing in school, if I needed anything. Nothing over the top, just normal grandma attention. But to me it meant so much because she was literally the only person in my family who seemed to care about what I did. My grandfather had died when I was a baby. I don't remember anything about him, but my dad almost never talked about him, and when he did, he got all tense and changed the subject quickly. Fast forward to 8 months ago. My grandmother was like 84 years old, and had been sick for a while. Nothing super serious, but you know, age. When she died, it was kind of expected, but still sad. We went to the funeral, everything normal. Lots of people from the town where she lived. My aunts, Clara and Linda, my dad's sisters, were there with their families. After the funeral, my grandmother's lawyer, an older man with thick glasses whose name was something like Patterson or Peterson, told us there was a will reading scheduled for the following week, and that only certain family members needed to be present. This is where things get weird. The lawyer called me directly to confirm I was going to be there. He didn't call my dad to tell me. He called me. And when I asked if the whole family was going to be there, he said no, just me, my dad, my 2 aunts, and some specific cousins. Michael wasn't on the list, which seemed super strange to me because it was always him who got everything. But whatever. I didn't think too much about it. I figured maybe my grandmother had left something small for all the grandchildren or something like that. The will reading was at the lawyer's office, an old place with dark wood paneling and that smell of old books. My aunts arrived first, then my dad, and I was the last one. My dad looked nervous, which was also weird because he was normally pretty confident. The lawyer started reading all the boring legal stuff, declaring that my grandmother was of sound mind and all that, and then he got to the important part, a grandmother's house, which was in an area that had appreciated quite a bit and was worth about $600,000, plus another $250,000 in savings and investments, was going to be divided into 3 parts. 1 part for Clara, 1 part for Linda, and 1 part for my dad. So far, all normal. That's what we expected. But then the lawyer looked directly at me and said, "However, the portion corresponding to your father will be inherited directly by you, Alex, not by him." The silence in that office was like unreal. My dad went pale. My aunts looked at each other with an expression I couldn't decipher, and I was like, "What? Excuse me?" The lawyer continued, explaining that my grandmother had been very specific in her instructions, that my dad's part should go directly to me, and that there was no legal way to change it. My aunts received their parts normally and could do whatever they wanted with their money, but my dad's part was mine, period. My dad immediately started protesting, saying this didn't make sense, that his mother wouldn't do something like this, that maybe she was confused when she made the will. The lawyer let him talk for a minute and then pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandmother's shaky handwriting. He handed it to me and said my grandmother had given him instructions that only I should read this, in private, when I was ready. The rest of the meeting was a disaster. My dad demanding explanations that the lawyer couldn't or wouldn't give, my aunts trying to calm him down, and me sitting there with that envelope in my hands wondering what the hell was going on. I didn't open the letter there. I went straight to my apartment, made myself a drink even though it was midday, and sat down on my couch. My grandmother's handwriting was hard to read because her hand shook so much, but the message was crystal clear. Basically, it said there was something I needed to know, something she and my grandfather had kept secret for decades. When my mom met my dad, she was already pregnant with Michael. Michael's biological father was another guy, someone who had disappeared from my mom's life before she knew she was pregnant. My dad met my mom, fell in love, and decided to raise Michael as if he were his own. But here's the part that blew my mind. My grandfather, my dad's dad, was furious when he found out. He told my dad he was an idiot for raising another man's child, that he was dishonoring the family, all this old-fashioned, horrible shit. My grandfather basically disowned my dad, told him he didn't want to know anything about him as long as he stayed with my mom and Michael. My dad chose my mom and Michael, obviously, and that's why we never had a relationship with my grandfather. But my grandmother, she didn't agree with what my grandfather did. She maintained secret contact with my dad all these years, saw him when she could, sent money from time to time without my grandfather knowing. The letter continued, explaining that when I was born, 3 years after my parents got married, my grandmother was happy to have a grandchild who was biologically her son's. Not that she didn't love Michael, the letter said, but I was her direct blood, and she wanted to make sure I was well taken care of. She had noticed over the years how my dad treated Michael differently, better, as if he were compensating for something or proving to the world that it didn't matter that he wasn't his biologically. And she had seen how I was sidelined all the time. So when she made her will, she decided that her part should go to me, not to my dad, because she knew that if the money went to my dad, he would probably give it all to Michael or divide it in a way that would leave me with less. I sat there for like an hour after reading that letter, literally unable to move. Everything suddenly made sense. The years of being ignored, of seeing my dad treat Michael like he was a prince while I was practically invisible, it was all because my dad was overthinking every decision, trying to prove that it didn't matter that Michael wasn't his biologically. And meanwhile, I, his actual blood son, was paying the price for that insecurity. My dad started calling me the next day. And when I say calling me, I mean he called me like 15 times that day. At first I didn't answer because I didn't know what to say to him, but eventually I answered because he wasn't going to stop insisting. His voice sounded desperate, almost like begging, telling me we needed to talk about the inheritance, that it wasn't fair that I got everything and he got nothing, that it was his mother and the money should be his. I tried to explain that technically it was his part, just that she had left it directly to me, but he kept insisting that was the same as leaving him with nothing. He wanted me to sign papers to transfer the money to him, or at least half. I told him I needed time to process everything, which was true, and I hung up. But the calls kept coming. Then Michael started calling too, saying this was ridiculous, that Grandma clearly wasn't thinking straight when she made the will, that I had a moral responsibility to share the money with them. And that's when something clicked in my head. All my life I had been waiting for my family to treat me like I mattered, like I was just as valuable as Michael. And now that I finally had something they wanted, suddenly, I was important. Suddenly they needed to talk to me. Suddenly, my decisions mattered. About 2 weeks after the will reading, my dad and Michael showed up at my apartment without warning. They knocked on the door like at 9 at night, and when I opened it, there they were both, with those serious faces they put on when they were going to have an important conversation. They came in without me really inviting them, and my dad sat on my couch like it was his house. Michael stood there, arms crossed, all intimidating. My dad started with his speech about how we were family, that family supports each other, that Grandma wouldn't have wanted me to keep everything while they had nothing, especially when he was her son. And there's something in me broke, or maybe finally fixed itself, I'm not sure. I told them, "Really? Now you want to talk about family? Now that there's money involved suddenly, I'm part of the family? Because for the last 27 years it didn't seem to matter much to you that I existed." I reminded them of every game of Michael's they went to and every concert of mine they missed. I reminded them of the car they bought Michael and the 2 years I spent taking the bus. I reminded them of every time my achievements were minimized, while anything Michael did was celebrated like he'd won the Nobel Prize. Michael interrupted me, saying I was exaggerating, that they had always treated me well, that I was making things up. And that's when I really exploded. I yelled at them. "You made me feel invisible my whole life. You made me think there was something wrong with me, that I wasn't enough. And now that finally someone saw me, someone decided I deserved something, you come asking me to give it away?" My dad tried to calm down, saying I didn't understand the situation, that there were reasons for how everything had been, but I didn't want to hear it. I told them to leave my apartment and not come back until they could treat me like a human being and not like a source of money. They left, but the calls continued. Text messages, emails, even my mom called a couple of times trying to mediate, saying I was being selfish, that my dad had worked his whole life and deserved something from that inheritance. But I kept thinking about my grandmother's letter, about how she had seen all this unfold for years and had made the conscious decision to make sure I was protected. And I realized that if I gave in now, if I gave them the money, it would be like saying that whole history of being treated as second best was okay, that it didn't matter. About a month after all this, my dad showed up alone at my apartment. This time he looked different, less aggressive, more defeated. He asked if we could really talk, without yelling, just man to man. I had already been processing all this with a therapist, which was helping me quite a bit not to go completely crazy, so I agreed. We sat down and he started talking about how hard it had been to raise Michael knowing he wasn't his biological son, how he had always been afraid that someone would find out and use it against him, how he had tried to overcompensate for everything to prove it didn't matter. I asked him directly if he knew why Grandma had left her part to me. He was quiet for a long while, and then said he supposed it had something to do with the disagreement he'd had with my grandfather years ago, but that he never knew exactly what the will said. I decided to show him my grandmother's letter. I read it, shaking a little because I knew it was going to change everything. When I finished, my dad was pale, like literally no color in his face. He sat there for like 5 minutes without saying anything, just looking at the floor. He finally spoke and asked me how I had found out about that. I told him Grandma had written it all, in the letter the lawyer gave me. I asked him if it was true, and he nodded, very slowly. He confirmed that my mom was pregnant when they met, that he had decided to raise Michael as his own, that my grandfather had disowned them for it. But then he added something that wasn't in the letter. He said he had never wanted me to feel less important, that he loved me the same as Michael, but that he had always felt he had to compensate Michael for something for not being his biological father, for having put him in that position. I told him, "But you gave me less to give him more. Don't you see that's exactly the problem?" He went quiet again. Before he left, he told me he needed time to think about everything, but that he was asking me to reconsider the inheritance thing, that Michael wasn't to blame for any of this, and that it would be devastating for him to find out the money he thought was going to help him wasn't going to come. I didn't promise him anything. Things got ugly after that. About 2 weeks later, I received a letter from a lawyer. Not my grandmother's, a different one. My dad and Michael were contesting the will, saying my grandmother wasn't in her right mind when she made it, that she had dementia or something, and that the will should be invalidated. Which was a complete lie because my grandmother was completely lucid until the end, but they still had the right to try it legally. I hired my own lawyer, which cost me like $5,000 just to start, and we prepared to fight this in court. The legal process was a nightmare that lasted about 4 months. They had to bring witnesses to testify about my grandmother's mental state, review her medical records, all that stuff. My aunts, Clara and Linda, testified on my behalf, saying my grandmother was completely aware and clear when she made the will, that she had even discussed her reasons with them before she died. That was important because it basically destroyed my dad's argument. The judge finally ruled that the will was valid, that there was no evidence my grandmother wasn't in her right mind, and that her wishes should be respected. When the verdict came out, Michael was waiting for me outside the courthouse. He looked furious, with his face all red and the veins in his neck showing. He yelled at me that I was selfish, that I had divided the family over money, that he was never going to forgive me for this. And something in the way he spoke, in how he blamed me for everything when he had been the favorite all his life, made me make a decision that probably changed everything forever. I told him, "Michael, there's something you need to know." I took out a copy of my grandmother's letter that I had been keeping, in my briefcase. I gave it to him and said, "Read it, and then you'll understand why Grandma did what she did." He opened it right there, on the courthouse steps, and I watched him read every line. His expression changed like 3 times while he read, from confusion to shock to something that looked like pure pain. When he finished, he looked at me with his eyes filling with tears and asked me if this was real. I told him yes, that Dad had confirmed it to me. Michael stood there for like a minute, with the letter shaking in his hands, and then he turned around and left without saying anything else. He didn't walk toward where my dad was waiting in the parking lot, he just left in the opposite direction. My dad saw me from a distance and must have realized something had happened, because he tried to run toward me, but I was already getting in my car and I left. I found out later from my Aunt Linda, who still talked to me from time to time, that Michael had confronted my dad that same night. That there had been a horrible fight where Michael yelled at him that his whole life had been a lie, that everything he thought about himself was based on false information. Apparently, Michael moved out of my parents' house about a week after that, went to live with some friends, and stopped answering my dad's calls almost completely. My mom, according to my aunt, was devastated by everything, saying her family had been destroyed, but she never called to talk to me directly about any of this. I sold my part of my grandmother's house about 6 months after all this drama. The house sold quickly because it was in good condition and in an area that was developing quite a bit. My part was like $200,000 from the house, plus about $83,000 from the savings and investments. Not as simple as dividing $850,000 into 3 because there were taxes and legal expenses and all that stuff, but it was still a lot of money, more money than I had seen in my life. I used part of that to pay off all my student debts, which were like $35,000, bought a decent car so I didn't have to worry about breakdowns anymore, and saved the rest. With some of the money, I also started my own accounting, consulting business. I had always wanted to work for myself, but had never had the capital to do it. Now I have like 3 regular clients, and it's growing slowly. I'm not a millionaire or anything, but it's mine, and I'm building something that matters to me. My aunts congratulated me when I told them, said my grandmother would be proud that I was using the money to build a future instead of just spending it. I haven't talked to my dad in about 6 months. The last time he tried to call me was on my birthday 2 months ago, and I didn't answer. I didn't block his number because I don't want to close that door completely, I guess, but I'm not ready to talk to him either. Michael sent me a text message about 3 weeks ago. It just said, "We need to talk when you're ready." I haven't responded yet. Part of me feels guilty for giving him that letter, for revealing something that basically destroyed his perception of his own identity. But another part thinks he had the right to know the truth, that living a lie isn't better than facing a painful truth. My therapist says, I need to process the grief of the family I thought I had versus the family I actually had. She says it's normal to feel anger and guilt at the same time, that they're not mutually exclusive emotions. I'm working on that, trying to understand that I deserve to be treated better, That my grandmother's inheritance wasn't a whim, but the recognition of someone who saw what was happening and decided to do something about it. Some days I believe it. Other days I wonder if I should have shared the money anyway, if keeping family peace was worth more than being right. What I do know is that for the first time in my life, I'm not waiting for someone else to validate my existence or tell me I'm enough. I have my business. I have my apartment that's small, but it's mine. I have some friends I met in group therapy who understand what it's like to grow up feeling invisible. It's not perfect. There are days when I miss having a normal family, when I wish I could call my dad just to chat or invite Michael for a beer. But then I remember how I felt during all those years, always waiting for crumbs of attention, always wondering what I had done wrong to not be loved the same way. Last week, one of my aunts, Clara, invited me to dinner with her family. We went to an Italian restaurant and her kids, my cousins who are younger than me, asked me about my business. We talked about accounting, difficult clients, goals for next year. Nobody mentioned the will, nobody mentioned the family drama. It was just a normal dinner where I was part of the conversation naturally. While driving back home that night, I realized that was something I had never had with my dad and Michael, that feeling of being comfortable, of belonging without having to prove anything. I don't know if I'm ever going to reconcile with my dad or with Michael. I don't know if they're ever going to understand why I needed to keep that inheritance, why I couldn't just give in and make peace. What I do know is that my grandmother saw me when no one else did, and she gave me not just money but validation, proof that I wasn't crazy, that what I lived through was real and not something I imagined. And that validation from someone who knew me my whole life is worth more than any reconciliation based on pretending the past didn't exist. So here I am, at 27 years old, with money in the bank that gives me options I never had, a business I'm building from scratch, and a family that's broken but maybe was never really whole to begin with. Some days I think I should try to fix things. Other days I wonder if there's anything to fix or if I'm just learning to live with the truth of what it always was. My therapist says I don't have to have all the answers now, that it's okay to be in process, in transition. I guess that's what I am now. Someone in the process of discovering who they are without being defined by being the forgotten son, without waiting for someone else to tell me I matter.